So, welcome to Deeper Dig with the Small Farms Winter Webinar Series. These bonus episodes are meant to continue each week's webinar topic in conversation with members of the local foods and small farms team, commercial ag, and that week's presenter. In these informal chats, we talk about this week's topic, we answer some of those lingering questions, and we hear more from our speaker. I'm Grant McCarty. I'm a local foods and small farms educator for Joe Davis, Stevenson, and Winnebago counties. I'm joined by Bronwyn Ailey, local foods and small farms educator for Gallatin, Hamilton, Hardin, Pope, Saline, and White counties. How are you doing today, Bronwyn?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm very good. Good weather down there?
Yes. After Monday night's low temperature, we're back on a trending upward scale, I think, and we should go from our park of Monday to the shorts on Friday. So.
Well, I was telling Katie we got snow on Monday, so I was really happy about that in Northern Illinois.
I'll quit complaining.
Yeah. We're also joined by Nathan Johanny. Nathan Johanny is a commercial agriculture educator for Madison, Monroe, and St. Clair counties. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing good, Grant. How are you?
Oh, doing good. Similar weather patterns for you?
Similar weather, maybe just a touch cooler, but not too bad. I think we got down to, I think, like 31 on Monday or Monday night, somewhere around that. So a little patchy frost, but nothing, no damage that I saw of any kind. But yeah, still chilly enough. And yeah, 83 for Saturday.
Oh my God. Now, are you getting close to pumpkin planting?
We got another, probably a good month, a little more than that before I get too worried about that.
All right, so you guys got a good month to make sure everything is right in line before they go in, huh?
Yep, got lots to do on that topic. So,
and finally, we're joined by Katie Bell. Katie Bell is the local foods and small farms educator for Franklin, Jackson, Perry, Randolph, and Williamson counties, and was our presenter on Backyard Swine. Hi, Katie. How are you?
Doing good. The weather is nice down here, but it's really windy and overcast. So I'm happy to be recording this instead of out there.
So your topic, Backyard Swine, was one that, we looked at our webinar series. I feel like you were probably the only one that covered animal production.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, but we get that every year. We always get requests for some kind of topic like animal production. So we were really happy to have, something like Backyard Swine covered before. Have you presented this topic before in any kind of local programming?
Not this specifically. I've done some animal science programs with the 4-H kids. And then I've also done some other like backyard livestock. I've done chickens, and then I think we'll probably do a sheep one at some point. But I have not done the swine yet. Hopefully I can replicate that here soon.
Yeah. And now, do you have backyard swine or you just have swine?
So we've had both. Currently I have neither, but we grew up raising pigs for both 4-H, and then before that my family raised pigs. Now we think of pigs kind of as being like the larger industrial confinement. And so, 20, 30, 40 years ago, people did raise just a few pigs to have for, their own uses, and then maybe to sell a few. And then over the last few years, and maybe the pandemic kind of helped it along too, where people wanted to source their own food again a little bit more. And so we're kind of seeing more interest in raising a few animals at home, and pigs fit well into that system.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, because we knew there was a lot of like gardening trends in the pandemic where everyone started vegetable gardening. That's so interesting that people also thought, yes, I want to also raise pigs in the backyard.
Yeah, and I think too with animals, a lot of people think chickens, and then once they've kind of mastered that, they're looking for something that's a little more advanced or a little more, meat production. But pigs are nice because you don't need a lot of space, where sheep and goats and cattle, they're all grazers. So they need a lot more space to be able to roam and graze to meet their dietary needs, and then also just to have enough space to move around. But pigs, you can really keep them, as long as you don't have any zoning regulations or anything, they can be kept, in a fairly small area Maybe you have a concrete pad where there used to be a garage or a patio or something. That would work well. And if you do have the space where you can turn them out and make it more of a pasture situation, that works good too.
Now, the Brahman and Nathan, do either of you have swine production experience? I have none. So it might be all three of us that have none. I don't know.
The sum total of my experience is the neighbor next to us when I was growing up as a kid had raised hogs. And so they would occasionally get out and they would be in our yard. So that was always fun to help with the sow roundup. But that's the sum total of my experience.
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of similar to Bronwyn. On the farm, before I was around, we used to have hogs, and we would always usually have a hog butchered from a neighbor or something. So I do remember some of that side and have some familiarity, but certainly heard lots of stories and tales of the things they used to raise, and kind of some general understanding, but I haven't done a lot of it myself.
So you've got three novices, Katie, I guess is what it sounds like. So what should, if the three of us decided, okay, we want to get started on a small scale with this, what would be like some of the main advice that you would really give us to?
I would say, start with everything else, start small, maybe start with feeder pigs, and I can explain about that a little bit, but feeder pigs would be young weaned pigs, somewhere in that 20 to 40 pound range that you'd buy maybe locally, get 2, 3, 4 of them, and keep them throughout the season, 5 or 6 months. And then at the end of that, you'd sell them to butcher or have them butchered, and you could sell halves or pieces with a neighbor, and split them up that way. It gets a little more complicated when you talk about keeping them year round, and raising them, because then obviously you're going to need a sow, a female pig, and then you're going to need a boar, a male pig. And so that can be more complicated as far as fencing and things goes, and keeping them separate, except when you want them to be together. And then also finding housing for farrowing and things like that, which is when the sow gives birth. And there can be, we've done, all the way through, raised our own show pigs and stuff whenever I was growing up, and raised just pigs for market. And because the sow can have anywhere from 4 to 13 piglets and raise them successfully, you can pretty quickly, triple your, investment. And, so you can go from 1 pig to 14 pretty quickly. And then you could then transfer to selling people feeder pigs and things like that. The main overheads with that would be feeding your sow and your boar throughout the year, even whenever they're not providing you with any kind of income, and keeping them maintained. So that would be starting out. I would recommend something simple where there's a definite start and end date, with the feeder pigs. Fencing is going to be very important, more so probably than any other kind of livestock, because pigs are pretty intelligent. And once they learn that there's a weak spot in the fence, they will kind of continually go back to that spot if they think they can get out. So having good quality fencing, making sure that they're well fed and happy where they're at, will also help deter them from trying to get out. And they have very strong snouts, so they can kind of pick things up from the bottom. And so making sure things are either tied down or you have them trained to an electric fence. Those are kind of like 2 of the biggest things, like getting started, that you're like keeping them contained is going to be something to keep in mind. And when we talk about small scale kind of backyard, maybe you just have them in a little pen in your backyard, kind of on the dirt. They can be very destructive. And probably in kind of a more confined area, they're going to make a wallow, they're going to tear things up, and kind of pack that soil down. So you either need to plan that you're going to have that area sacrificed for the duration of having pigs there, and then maybe a season or two after, or you need to plan on moving them very regularly so that you're not wearing one area out. Or if you have a concrete pad that you can keep them on, then that eliminates that problem. So I've seen it done lots of different ways. We mainly had some older areas that had concrete lots, and so that's where we kept them a lot of times. We kind of tried having them in some dirt areas, but again, it was mostly sacrifice. And then we kind of had some accidental back porch pigs a time or two, because they would get out and then get on the porch and eat the flowers.
Back porch pig, okay.
So that was, of course, unintentional. But like I said, as long as they're pretty happy where they're at, they tend to try that fence less too, as long as all their needs are met that way.
So
and I
have a question, Katie, because when I think about fruits and vegetables, one of the first questions that I always think about is variety selection. So if you had to select a breed what breed would you suggest if I wanted to get just a couple of hogs to raise in the backyard for me and the kiddos to eat on? What would be your suggestion?
So if you're kind of
we really like bacon, okay? Is there an all bacon breed?
Okay, so there is unfortunately not an all bacon pig. I have gotten that question and no one has been able to figure it out yet. But oftentimes when you're looking for selecting a pig, especially kind of in that smaller backyard setting, to keep in mind, just like with fruits and vegetables, cross genetics are going to be the best. So a crossbreed, you get that hybrid vigor, you kind of get the best of both worlds. And those are probably going to be the most common pigs that you would find kind of in these areas if you're just looking for some feeder pigs to raise for you and your family, a crossbred. So pigs generally are divided into two different categories. We have the maternal breeds, which would be have better mothering capabilities and larger litter sizes. The piglets tend to be more vigorous, things like that. But the downside is they don't grow quite as quickly and the muscle development is a little bit less. They tend to gain weight quicker so that you would have more fatty bacon. So then in turn, we cross that with the terminal breeds, which would be, meat producing breeds, have more heavily muscled. They tend to have, they tend to be a little bit harder to work with. They're not quite as docile sometimes when we think about moving them around. So some common breeds that are kind of a dual purpose, and I talked about this a little bit too in the webinar, but we raised a lot of Durocs, Hampshires, Berkshires. Those are all terminal breeds. And then for our straight market breeding, we would cross those with either Landrace, Yorkshire, or Chester White. And those three are all more maternal breeds. And kind of coincidentally, if you're looking at them, pigs that are white tend to be the maternal breeds, whereas pigs that have color to them tend to be the terminal breeds. When you cross the two together, you get a lot of what they call speckled pigs. They just have some kind of like black or brown spots on their bodies. They tend to be crossbred. Those tend to be your best for making feeder pigs to keep in your backyard. There also are several kind of specialty pasture breeds that have come about. And one of those that's really popular that I've no personal experience with, but I've heard a lot of really good things about them would be the Kuni. And they come in a wide range of colors. They're really pretty, but they have been bred to be maternal and docile, have pretty good meat quality, as well as not being overly aggressive diggers. Because if you're talking about a pasture setting, you don't want animals that just root constantly. You want something that's gonna settle and not tear up the pasture land that you are putting them in. Idaho pasture pig is another specialty breed that's kind of a composite pig as well that I've been hearing about a little bit more over the last several years. But yeah, I'd recommend getting started, just getting some kind of commercial crossbreds from somebody local, talking to a neighbor, someone in your area is gonna have a few pigs that they'll sell.
All right, so one other thing, so we talked about picking your pig. So what would be a basic, what kind of rations, like, food, like what would be the core things that you're going to use, need to have on hand for, rations, feed and stuff? What would be your kind of favorite go-to thing, especially thinking more, more of a small scale person? What would you go to have, as that core feed source?
Yeah, so the biggest things, and especially starting out with just a few, I would recommend getting something that's pre-blended, pre-made, pre-bagged, that already has the correct ration. The biggest thing with that is that when you start out with smaller pigs, anywhere from that weaning to 12 to 14 weeks, you're going to want to have them on a starter grower kind of feed. That's going to be higher in protein. So when you start out, you want about 17 to 18% of protein in there. Typical protein sources for pig feed, that tends to be soybean meal now. Sometimes it changes a little bit just depending on the price of grain and stuff like that, but typically it's a soybean based feed, and then also a corn grind as well. So you can buy, if you just have 2 pigs, you could get the pelleted bag feed from any farm store. You can also talk to your feed mills. A lot of them still grind some of their own feed or have ground mixes that they sell. The other thing to keep in mind is that pigs do get the best gain, have the best gain ratio when they're young. So from 45 to 75 pounds, they're going to be able to do 1 pound of gain for every 2 pounds of feed. As they get bigger, that number kind of backs off. So as they're, between that 75 to 125 pounds, it's going to take 3 pounds of feed to put 1 pound of gain on them. And once we've got them kind of through that initial growth stage to 12 weeks, we're going to back down the ration from 17% protein to about 15% protein, because at that point, while muscle growth and structural growth is important, we're also wanting them to just gain weight and put on a little bit of fat and things. We don't want them too lean either. So there's kind of a fine balance that happens. But as long as you're picking a pre-made, mix, you'll be checking all those boxes for them.
So I guess I have another question related to this. I think a lot of times we hear about, we can feed our food scraps to the pigs. How does that play into when we're thinking about their ratio on this? Is that just additional food that we're throwing out there to them, like as a supplement to what we're going to normally feed?
Yeah. So I guess I should back up just a little bit and say that when you are feeding them and you're trying to get them to gain weight rapidly, because we're feeding them at this point for a market animal that we will butcher. So we want them to gain the maximum amount of weight in the shortest amount of time. The best way to do that is to provide them, free choice feed. That does not mean take the whole amount of feed that they're going to need to grow and put it in a barrel and say, okay, we're done. But making sure that they constantly can have access to that feed and that it's clean, and that you're not having any parasites, bugs, mice, anything like that getting in there, but having a free choice feeder for them to come back to. Because unlike a lot of our ruminant animals, sheep and goats, pigs both because of their stomach structure and then also because they don't graze the way the other animals do. They can kind of self-regulate their food intake, so they won't just eat until they can't eat anymore or until the food's gone. They'll stop. So having them on free choice feed is usually the best way to get them to gain. So when you're putting out food scraps and things like that, and I would say mostly, your fruit and vegetables, breads, things like that would be okay. No meats of any kind. So putting that out, that's going to help, but it may be individual to what you do. So you may see that, oh, I was able to get them to market weight with 100 less pounds of feed because I was able to supplement them with table scraps or supplement them by letting them have pasture. That is one thing with pasture pork production. While they are on pasture, they still need to be supplemented with grain because they have a much higher protein requirement and they cannot get the same things out of grass that cattle or sheep can. So that's something to keep in mind.
Is there, thinking about like a backyard kind of a small scale study of swine, is there going to be a lot of waste that I'm going to need to manage? I guess, is manure management something else that I need to kind of really consider, especially depending on how many I might be raising?
Yeah. Yes. So I would say too, manure management is going to be a factor with any kind of livestock. The more of them you have, the more manure you have. But the pigs in particular, they are, despite the common like old wives' tales and stuff, they are pretty tidy. They tend to have kind of a designated bathroom area. So you're going to have one spot where things are going to kind of naturally collect. So you will have to manage that. But in comparison to something like cattle or horses, the waste is going to be somewhat less. It's a smaller animal, a different kind of form and things too. But the thing to be aware of with swine in particular is going to be making sure that you're not near a natural water source or near like a well or something like that. That does come into play with all types of livestock, but when we think about keeping swine, in kind of a smaller area, maybe if we're talking about backyard, somewhat closer to town, keeping, just being aware of where your ditches and your water source and where those things run off is going to be important to manage. But it isn't, I wouldn't say it's something that's overwhelming. If you just have a few, it could be handled with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and a good compost pile. Once you get into the, if you're talking 10 or 15 animals, then it gets to be a little bit more. But it's just kind of all perspective, as far as we scale up. So it's just, management is going to be the biggest thing. And like I said, the fewer animals you have, the less you have to deal with. I will say, depending on how many neighbors you have, you may want to make sure that they are on board or that you give them some bacon to build some goodwill, because pigs have a very distinct smell, and even well-kept animals, they still, it smells like pigs. And it's not necessarily overwhelming, but it's just something, if you're in kind of close proximity to your neighbors, you might want to run it by them. Even if, your zoning and things says it's okay, you still want to, keep that in mind.
Katie, I was sitting here thinking, with a different question. So we do have a few small scale growers that, as they're advertising their swine product, their, pasture raised hogs or pasture raised pigs. And we think about like the Twilight meeting that we had last year at the the small scale cattle farm that was utilizing regenerative grazing and rotational grazing. If someone is raising pasture pigs, I would assume they are doing rotational grazing as well.
Yes.
Yes or no? And then how often would that be? Because like the farm that we visited last year, again, at the twilight meetings, they were rotating daily, as they were managing their pasture. Now, it may be for different reasons, but what would be like kind of a time frame for rotating pastures?
So depending on, so the timing can be somewhat depending on the farm and the goals and stocking density, how many animals you have on that space. For pastured pigs that are truly, in a pasture system, especially a rotational system, the farmers that I have talked to that are doing it and having good luck with it, they tend to do more of a silvopasture setup. So that would be in the semi-wooded areas. They get some of the most nutritional value for the pigs in areas where they have, nut trees and things like that already, because the pigs will eat acorns and hickory nuts and things like that. Also, because the pigs are not necessarily relying on the grass, the silvopasture areas that are lower light and lower grass quality, also, they're a good use for that, putting the pigs there. The farmer that I talk to, they usually rotate between 1 and 3 days, just depending on how much space they have. Moves can also be dependent on the weather. So if it's extremely muddy, I'm assuming they would probably either move them more often, or they would kind of hold them in a kind of a sacrifice area so they aren't damaging the rest of it. Usually it's safe to say like a once a day move if you're going to be rotating them. The biggest trouble spots with any animal on pasture is going to be the watering areas, pigs especially, because like we talked about, the designated bathroom area, they kind of like to have that near their watering source. So if you could at all, moving that water source is going to help protect your land as well. So they're not just camping out in one place. And you can't always do that because of, just whatever restrictions you might have on your own property. If you have a big enough space, you could, turn them out in kind of a conventional pasture system. People still do that, and they just have them out in a fixed permanent pasture, but you are going to get those issues that we get with permanent pasture where, you get spots where overgrazed, spots that are undergrazed, areas that the animals will congregate. So especially with pigs, rotating them would be very useful. And that's the people that are doing it really successfully are rotating them through silvopasture.
So Kate, I'm always going to think back to fruits and vegetables. And some fruits we need more than 2 just to have your fruits for pollination. Can I get away with just 1 pig, or do I need more than 1 pig in order to have a happy pig, in order to kind of have the full experience of raising pigs?
So pigs are pretty, like, they're fairly social animals. We've talked about they're pretty intelligent as far as livestock goes, but any of the livestock really tend to be pretty social group animals. So pigs, you need probably at least 2 of them, as a group. And the thing with pigs that is often different than other livestock animals is that they tend to be kind of in cohorts or family groups. So if you bring in pigs, if you have to mix them from 2 different locations, you want to start them in a totally new area. So you wouldn't want to have 1 pig that you already have and then buy them a friend.
Neutral area. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Because it can be territorial.
Sure.
So having either a family group that you're buying a couple piglets from the same litter, or starting with a neutral location if you have to mix bands. The other thing with pigs is that and we may talk about this more, but one of the biggest issues with raising pigs is that pigs tend to have more illness issues than some other kinds of livestock, as far as illnesses that they can get from other pigs. And so making sure that especially if you're raising pigs, that your biosecurity is pretty good. So if you are bringing in animals from somewhere else, quarantine them for a few days before you mix them. If you go somewhere to look at other animals, either wash your shoes, wear a different pair of shoes, put on the little plastic booties, just to keep things from being cross-contaminated. You're going to have less issues with that with backyard animals, small scale, just because those animals are building a pretty healthy immune system, being outside, being in the dirt, having a really diverse diet. But it's just something to keep in mind. But yeah, you need at least 2 for them to be happy.
And how big of an area would I need for two pigs, do you think? I'm not getting any. We're just doing a scenario here, okay?
Just doing a scenario.
Back porch, Grant?
Yeah, Grant.
The restrictions on backyard chickens are pretty limiting here. I cannot imagine what backyard pigs are going to be.
So typically for growing pigs, it's about 8 square feet of space per pig. And so if you have an outside pen, I'd recommend a little bit more space than that.
You said
But
8?
yeah, they don't need much.
Wow. So I could. So then my backyard would work. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. If you can get it Pasture.
I feel like I like your original, like a 10 by 10, just as, it's one thing if you have more confinement, but I think, I even just think of, barns where, you'd have like small stalls or even like 4-H barns that have stalls, like a 10 by 10-ish or so, give or take for a couple. Yeah, you can.
And that's why I originally said 10 by 10, because that's kind of how we never had anything stocked that tightly as 8 square feet. Because and 10 by 10s, the office that I'm sitting in is a little bigger than that, but I'm thinking about that space to then also provide, if you're keeping them in the backyard, to be able to have like a little shelter or hut for them to get into that's 3-sided, having that like 10 by 10 paddock area would be better. But kind of as like a minimum space requirement per pig, the 8 square feet. And you do have to think about that the pigs are raised in kind of, pretty close confinement. And so that is kind of where some of those minimum numbers come from too.
Just see, with that kind of spacing, just think of how many pigs you can fit in that barn back there at your office.
I know.
As you were lining off your look at your office dimensions, like, are you gonna like go in and just have a pig in your office one day whenever the boss comes in?
Well,
she's already had chicks, so.
I've had chickens in here, so who knows what's next. But so far I haven't gotten the go ahead on the pigs in the office or in the barn, so we'll have to stick with the chickens for the time being. But as far as if you're keeping them in more of a pasture setting, which we've kind of been going back and forth on that, but if you were rotating them through pasture, and you had the recommended rates from University of Missouri is from weaning weight to about 100 pounds, you can put anywhere from 15 to 30 pigs per acre, depending on the size. So you could probably get 30, 40 pound pigs per acre. As they get bigger, then you're going to want to spread them out. And so that has to do both with enough space requirement and then also that you're not just absolutely tearing up the land that you have them on. But that's a pretty simple calculation to be able to then break down, however much space you do have, and then figure out how many pigs you could get in a 1/10 of an acre.
So, all right, so I've raised my pig. Now, what are some things, all right, when do I know it's time to go to market? All right, I made it through this, I fed it, what's, especially as a homeowner, or a home backyard swine enthusiast, where, how do you know these things? Obviously, you're probably not going to have a scale you're going to have them step up on. You're probably not going to load them up in the back of your Subaru or anything and take them for a ride. What would be some, I can drive to the local scale, weigh in, weigh out, what's some parameters or things that you can use to judge and say, all right, we're kind of where we need to be.
So one thing I would say would be, simply time, depending somewhat on the breed. If it's, the maturity can be anywhere from 5 to 8 months. Some of the slower growing pasture ones are going to be more on the 8 months kind of growth. As well as, feed consumption. It takes about 700 pounds of feed total to get them from that 40-pound weaning weight to 230, 240 pounds, which that 230 to 250 pounds is what we're looking at for market weight for butchering. So what you want to make sure of is that all of the pigs are similarly sized too, because when you're selecting them in the beginning, you don't want to like throw in the runt for fun. You want to pick like nice quality pigs that are all about the same size when you start out, so that way when we go to market, they all weigh about the same when we are ready to butcher them. Because if you're trying to hold one, so if you have one that's already ready to go and then you have 2 that are not, and you're trying to hold that one, he's going to put on a whole bunch of back fat. So for one thing, we're wasting feed. For another thing, we're going to have a bunch of gain and fat on the pig that, unless you're really interested in using lard for something, you've got a bunch of waste. So what you could do is throw them in the back of your Subaru and drive them, across the local grain scale. And what you weigh the car ahead of time, and then you go across and you weigh it again and see the difference. We have done this. We did have a trailer, but we took them across and just to see. But you get, especially maybe once you've done it your first season, or talk to somebody who has done it, they can pretty well tell approximately. And as long as they're somewhere around 200 pounds, they're ready to go. One thing too is that if they all look about the same, you want them to kind of just look like a tube. When you look down their back from their shoulders to their rump, you don't want them to have like a great big bulging belly. That's just extra fat that we don't need. You want them to be nice and smooth sided, and then kind of muscular across the back and into the rump, which is where judging and things comes in. 4-H shows and the judges, but that's what they're looking for is the quality of the animals and the muscular development. So just kind of by looking at that too, you can kind of tell, because you want some definition to the muscle, but you don't want them to look thin either. So kind of a happy medium.
And so I'll be working with like a processor, right? So should I like go ahead and reach out to a processor and determine a date? Is that kind of the way it tends to work before?
So before 2 years ago, I would say not necessarily. Like, you could kind of have a general idea, and then whenever it gets closer to time, go ahead and book an appointment. Now, with the way things have been going with processors, there are processors for cattle that are booked out like still 2 years. Those animals haven't even been born yet to get a processing date. So yeah, I would recommend kind of calling your local processor up if you're even thinking about doing this, and just saying, so when would you need to know? How many months out would you need to know? Mm-hmm. And then from there, you can time out, what you need to do. Because you can, to a certain extent, for example, if you already have your animals bought, you're started, and you call the processor and he says, well, I can't get you in for, 2 months past when you'd like to have them in. You can hold them to a certain extent. So you can feed them just like a maintenance amount of feed, so they won't gain any additional weight. It gets more complicated, like I said, when you're trying to catch one up. But you can kind of hold them. It can be a little more difficult to push them to gain, because they will typically eat whatever they want and not more than that. But keeping them in slightly smaller pens will keep them from running around and losing a lot of weight and stuff like that. So I would recommend, just having that conversation, and maybe even talking to, if you know someone else who's already doing it, kind of feeling out how they've done it in the past and learn from their successes and mistakes.
So with all this, obviously if nothing else, it can be engaging and very, I don't know, you feel very down to earth. There's another term I can't think of, but you know where your food is coming from, right? If you're doing this. So that's, obviously a main driver. As you're going through some of those numbers, I just wanted to think a little bit about the economics though. I just glanced, and corn's $8 a bushel, and soybeans are around 17. So even if you're you're looking at and that, granted that's the ration isn't just that, but some of these inputs, you could have a substantial amount of money in feed to get that. You said, what did you say again? It was like roughly from
about 700 pounds.
So you have so definitely some some expense in there. So along with all your time and things. So just any thoughts or other comments, or if anything, just obviously put that into perspective, because it does. I think it can be easy to underestimate how much you'll be spending in feed, or it's not just, I'll feed them a little bit, and then you realize you're buying, I don't know, let's say it's 2 or 3, 4 pounds of $20+ bag feed, a week or whatever. I'm just, kind of, all of a sudden you're like, I spent how many dollars this month on feed, and you're 1 month in. So
yeah, so that's a great point to bring up, because it's definitely not free, and it will probably end up costing you more than you realized, if you don't do a budget. There's lots of really great budgeting tools and things that you can find, and just do a quick budget and figure out. I will say that for one thing, the cost could be somewhat shared, because not only do you have feed, but you do also have a processing fee. That's going to be a pretty hefty cost as well, not to mention any additional processing that you want to get done. So anything more than like basic sausage grinding, you get your standard cuts of meat, any cured bacon, that's going to be an additional different process on top of that. Hams, smoked hams, that's going to be different on the cost. And so if you can help offset that cost somewhat by, if you figure out that you and your family will eat 1 pig's worth of meat throughout the year, and you want 1, you might get at least 2, maybe 3, and then you can sell those other pigs for a little bit of an upcharge, because it's locally raised, it's locally processed, and you can sell without getting too complicated into also selling meat and things like that. If you just sell it as halves or wholes, anyone can really do that, because basically what you're doing is just splitting the processing fee plus whatever the animal cost. You're basically selling them half of the live animal, and then they're paying part of the processing fee. Because as I said, it gets a little more complicated if you're trying to sell individual cuts of meat and things like that. We get into a whole other realm of things and licensing and stuff that you'd need. So that can help offset the cost by selling them. If you could also take those extra, you could get your own pig processed and then take those other pigs to the sale barn or the stockyard and just sell them for market weight. You'll probably be losing money at that point because they're not going to give you what they're worth in the time and the effort and the care that you took to raise them. A couple ways to help limit your costs would be to make sure that you choose the best quality animals that you can from the get-go. So you're not putting any more feed into them than you have to. To keep in mind also that, the price of grain is going up. The price of other meats is also going up. Pork tends to stay somewhat cheap, but even that, the price will raise, so it just depends. You're never going to be able to raise them for what you can go buy, Jimmy Dean sausage for, but it's a better quality product that where it came from. And so it just keeping that in mind and what value that has to you, and then what it costs you. So no, it's probably going to be an endeavor in which you probably lose a little bit of money, more money than you would if you just bought the bacon from the store, but you are, it's similar to, raising fruits and vegetables or shopping at the farmer's market, things like that, where it has to do with your value system, with your family and what you're looking for. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you're dealing with live animals, you may incur costs that have nothing to do with feeding them, or turning them into bacon. You may also have veterinarian costs. Your animals might get out and go eat your neighbor's flowers, and then you're going to have to pay them back for whatever damage that they did.
In bacon.
In bacon.
There goes your bacon.
And the other thing to keep in mind with this, if this is something that you want to do, or deciding if this is something that you want to do, like Bronwyn brought up earlier, there are no all bacon pigs. So if all you like is bacon, I don't recommend raising backyard swine. But if you are someone who enjoys cooking, and you're gonna know what to do, even with some of those more unique cuts that gets, not necessarily thrown away, but if you know what to do with some of that, then you could also take that, and then that's going to reduce the overall cost too, because you're actually using those cuts as well.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit on a question or thought that I had, because we always very commonly had a hog butchered, and yeah, there's things that, you don't usually go out and buy some of these, pork roast or other things like we would have, or we would even just have ham sliced and, and again, not cured even. So yeah, it's just a thing to be aware of, there's resources out there. Look up, the kind of cuts. You're gonna, you'll have ribs, you'll have pork chops, you'll have. If all else fails, you have lots of sausage, right? You can always, worst case, but you have that. But it's just, it's good to know, because it's, I know personally the times we have, we buy pork from the store. I don't buy all those, other cuts. And mainly pork chops or loins, and and maybe some bacon here or there, or so just know that you're getting the full package, and so all of those different cuts.
Yeah, and that's the thing to keep in mind too, is that you've worked to put 250 pounds of weight on an animal that I think the dress weight on a pig is like 50%, 50 or 60. So you're getting like, 100 pounds of meat from, 125 pounds of meat, maybe, if you did everything perfectly. And so that, I think, can be something to keep in mind too, is that you're like, I've got this whole pig's worth of meat, and then, you end up with just 100 pounds or 150 pounds of meat, so just something to keep in mind too. But I think that if you are, interested in raising your own meat, and pigs, yeah, I wouldn't encourage just anyone to do it, but if you are thinking that that's something that you want to do, pigs are kind of a good gateway. They're way less complicated in infrastructure, feeding, transport, butchery than cattle are, for example. So that's, and the turnaround time is much quicker. So I wouldn't say it's not for everyone, but if you're already considering doing something with raising your own meat, this is a good place to start. I see Grant's wheels like spinning.
You've not convinced me. So
I suppose that is a good thing, because I don't want to talk someone into something. I want you to be very aware of the issues that are associated with that, but also know that it can be a very rewarding process.
So if we were, like kind of what you were talking about, like marketing wise of like the different cuts of so forth, I mean, is there a lot of potential even too to really think about like, I mean, I've seen Berkshire pork used a lot. That word is used quite commonly. But are there other ways that we might want to think about marketing and other terminology even we might consider too?
Yeah. So I would say if you're, saying that it's, if it is truly like from a pasture system, that it's pasture raised, or that it's, somewhat, I don't know the exact labels with pigs, because with chickens, for example, cage free is something very different than free range. There's a big distinction there. You could probably say something in the marketing, that they're not confinement raised, or they're is something along those lines with that terminology. But then also, talking about the promoting that brand, that you do care what you're doing, and that you are putting more effort also into the welfare of the animals than just the mass production. Breeds and things, I'd say probably like the Berkshire, pork, that's what sticks out to people. But you could with some of those more specialty breeds, like even saying the breed, I feel like people would be like, "Ooh, that's exotic," to where that can kind of help you out. But just really on a small scale, if you were trying to get into selling or marketing meat, talking about your message, because that is something that sometimes we as farmers kind of fall short on, as marketing ourselves, marketing our brand. And so that's kind of where I would probably start. And then if you are doing anything special, if you are trying to follow some sort of organic or natural is a word that's being used that kind of doesn't have a lot of, like, naturally raised animals. There's not a standard definition of what that means, but that's something that, if you are following natural practices, trying to take care of the land, that's a term you could use.
Katie, in regards to like just the time of year and the overall general health of the animal, and maybe thinking about different parasites or diseases that may kind of spike up and then fall back down at different times of the year possibly. Is there a certain time of the year that's better to try to shoot for a butchering time, or can it just be
I mean, yeah, so I feel like most people get their pigs in their feeder pigs in the spring. So now, something to keep in mind with pigs is that they are not good at regulating their own body temperatures. So we mostly think of them getting hot really easy, but they also will get chilled. So that, like, spring through summer is going to be the best time to raise them. And so then you're shooting to butcher sometime in the fall, September, October. But we have in the past, and I think this was several years ago, I mean, I think we butchered some pigs in January, just because that was the timing that we had raised them, and then we took them, and that worked out. As far as diseases and worms, parasites, things like that, there's some pretty basic, commercial dewormers and things that you can give. Keeping them, you're going to have probably more issues pop up when they're pastured or in a pen on the dirt, because they're going to be rooting and going to be eating things, and that's, there's more worms there. Whereas if they were kept on like a pad, there's going to be less opportunity for that to happen. However, if you're bringing in animals from somewhere else, or, they'll find stuff to get into. But overall, keeping them healthy and things is going to make you less prone to diseases and communicable issues. If you are, like I said before, bringing in new animals, quarantining them is going to be important. If you have other existing animals. So yeah, just keeping them on a regular deworming schedule is going to be, I think, the best thing to do. And I think the climate tends to be more of a factor than anything else, because in the cold, in the wintertime, they're harder. You've got to keep them bedded. You got to provide them with a shelter that they can get in and get warm and be insulated. In the summertime, it's a little easier for us to help them regulate their temperatures because we can provide them with a wallow. We can mist them down. We can make sure they have shade and fans. But it can be a little more costly and more difficult to keep them warm in the wintertime.
Going back to some of the feed topics before, are there, so I know you can get commercial feeds and other things. If you had, is there anything that comes to mind, if you did have a little more acreage or had some ability to grow something to help supplement, what would, any things in mind? I know this is from years ago, long before I was involved in this, but they used to raise like an old, basically, kind of a processing type pumpkin it was intercropped in corn, and they would have a big pile of pumpkins and they'd throw a couple pumpkins in for the pigs and they'd root around, and that was done for multiple reasons, but a lot of it was, and this is probably 50 or 60 years ago, probably more than that was an alternate, feed source. This was a point in time when you raised livestock, you raised all your own feed as well. So, but for a person that has that need and wants to, maybe does have a green thumb for raising things, are there some things that you'd maybe go to say, that would maybe some good opportunities to kind of raise as a supplement?
Yeah. So the pumpkins would be good. Any of the vegetable scraps, like if you are also, have a large garden and, any of that stuff could go in there. They really like watermelons, pumpkins. I've given them tomatoes. One time we had a bunch of expired pancake mix that we gave them that you can feed, you can supplement that way. But I would say, as far as things that you can raise, if you are going to have them in more of a pasture setting, you can supplement them because pigs are not ruminants. They don't require the grass, the forages from grass, but they do, they will get more from legumes. So any of your clovers, alfalfas, those can be helpful to supplement their diet somewhat. You still are going to have to feed them a grain to adequately meet their protein needs, but a legume mix can be really good. If you're more of an advanced cover crop person and you can throw in some brassicas and things into that mix as well, those are all going to be things that they would like to eat and could help supplement as well. We have in the past fed, like a good quality alfalfa hay, or if we had hay that was kind of had been baled kind of late whenever it already had the seed heads on and stuff. We give them some of that. They like that for the seed heads. So that's going to be helpful to them, and kind of help cut back on some of your feed costs, your direct feed costs.
So one other thing that came to mind was, especially for those that maybe don't have or getting into this or interested in and haven't done this before. I know you're familiar with this. So everyone's like, oh, I'll get a couple pigs and we'll get some bacon. Well, then, well, they become a pet. So realistically speaking, is for a person wanting to get into this, how do you kind of frame your mindset? How do you, put this in just into perspective, so that way you don't, have this, 300-pound pet that just is a, decade-long staple or however long, because it's just there is some differences between having a pet and having livestock in a way. So yeah. Any thoughts on from your experiences in that?
So I think one thing, it got more difficult for us when we started raising pigs as well, because we would get a runt or a bottle baby or something that we would keep, and that we had a pig named Iggy that we had for years that was like, had a crippled leg because she was a bottle baby, and had no reason to keep her, but we had Iggy pig forever. So even someone who, you raise pigs for that purpose, it still happens. But I would say that a good way to frame your thoughts are that if you're doing this because you want to provide, good quality food to your family that's sustainably raised, that you have control over, you can also think about that you are providing that animal with the best life that you can provide it for, throughout that time period. Because if these are market pigs that we bought as feeder pigs, if you don't buy them and feed them up and butcher them, someone else is going to. And so that's kind of the circle of life for livestock animals. And so thinking about that you have done, the best job that you can do to make sure that they're well cared for, that they have, good quality feed and water and all those things. And then, then when it comes time, then, we move on. I would recommend against naming them if you can help it. And having 2 or 3, that helps too. And I guess keeping in mind too that it's not always sunshine and roses. At some point, they're going to make you really mad. They're going to do something. You're going to be like, all right, I'm going to be glad whenever we're done with this project for the year. So that's, kind of part of it too, to just keep in mind. And a lot of pigs that are specifically like those terminal breeds that we talked about, once they reach a mature weight, their quality of life can somewhat dwindle. They're bred to gain their breeding and things has been that they gain weight quickly. And so it can be difficult as they get 2 or 3 years old for them to move around and stuff too. And you don't want a 500-pound, animal that eventually isn't going to be able to stand up. So just keeping those things in mind too. Because even people who buy pigs, potbelly pigs, for example, or the teacup pigs, those often wind up, rehomed because they do grow so much larger than people realize. And so it's just, being aware of that, I think. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that wasn't something that had even occurred to me.
Or I guess if you're going to name them like pork chop and bacon or something, yeah. Something very, very focused.
We had a lot of pancakes whenever I was in 4-H. We had pancake and pig.
All right, Katie. Well, you've given us a lot to really think about and really consider, especially when it comes to backyard swine. Is there any final advice you'd like to share with us today?
So I'd say one thing that we kind of skirted around a little bit just in passing, talking about watering systems. Any kind of swine that you keep, water is equally as important as feed. And the way that you provide them that water is going to make your life easier or more difficult. You could just give them water in a pan or a bowl. But when you do that, for one thing, they will dump it pretty much immediately. They'll get a drink and then they'll just spill it. Pigs are also, as I've mentioned before, they're very tidy animals, so they don't want to drink dirty water. So if they get into that tank and lay down and it's all muddy and gross, they're not going to come back and drink out of it. So you'll have to probably be continually cleaning that tank. With that, they're probably not going to be drinking as much water because they're only going to drink it whenever it's fresh. So what you can do is providing them, the most common way is that they just call it a nipple water. And there's a little, similar to like a rabbit or a hamster water, there's a little trigger that they can push with their tongue and then the water will come out. A lot of pigs are raised with those, so they know how to use them. If they don't, I've seen where they say you can train them by putting like a little bit of grape jelly on it and then they will figure out how it works. Or if you have other pigs already, they'll teach them how to use it. But this typically, they can drink as much water as they want because they can keep coming back to that. And then also they can't, there's no way for them to tip it or dump it over. Though to keep in mind with those waters, they can get jammed. So if you have long pieces of straw or an area where there's sticks, sometimes stuff can get stuck in there. So if you're checking on your animals, make sure you check that water at least once a day in case, it gets flooded. Because that's like one of the quickest ways to make a big giant mess is for them to have a way to dump water everywhere. Also providing them, we talked a little bit about managing them in the heat, but providing them with a wallow somewhere is going to make it a little easier to keep them out of the clean water too. So just, allowing them to have a little bit of a muddy area, if you have them stationary, is probably going to be good for their temperature regulation and their quality of life, also for insect control as well.
Great. Well, yes, thank you, Katie, for that final piece of advice. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and especially for those that sat through with your webinar. We really hope this provides more kind of information on these topics. So thanks again for being with us today, Katie, and thanks to Nathan and Brodwin for being here today. You will find Katie's presentation on the Illinois Extension Local Foods and Small Farms YouTube channel, or by visiting go.illinois.edu/SFWW 2022 YouTube. Thank you for being with us today, and we'll see you for our final episode of our series coming up.